Indiana.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following senators be permitted to speak prior to the scheduled vote. Young for up to 5 minutes, Barrasso for up to 7 minutes, Stabenow for up to 5 minutes, and Cardin for up to 3 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, during his State of the Union address last week, President Biden spoke about solving the ongoing humanitarian crisis at our southern border, and he mentioned the name of Laken Riley. Laken Riley, as my colleagues know, lost her life because of that humanitarian crisis. Laken was a 22-year-old college student. She was murdered by an illegal alien last month. The illegal alien had been previously cited for theft and shoplifting, but was released. And those who knew her described Laken as a shining light and kind-hearted. Her calling in life, Mr. President, was to care for others. And she was on her way to answering that calling, studying nursing at Augusta University, when she was murdered by a Venezuelan national who crossed our border illegally. Now, to Laken's family and friends, your fellow Americans grieve with you. We're saddened by your loss. We pray, and we hope that in time you will find comfort. We should all find comfort in the example that Laken leaves behind. But let me not be the first to say, let me add my voice to the chorus of voices and emphasizing that words of condolence are not enough. No, far better for us to honor Laken's life by doing everything within our power to ensure that no other family endures this or a similar tragedy. So to President Biden, who said after his speech that he shouldn't have referred to Laken's murder as an illegal, and to any of my colleagues who's offended by the use of that term, let us dispense with misplaced outrage. Let's stop playing political word games. Let's speak as plainly as possible. The man who killed Laken Riley broke the law when he walked across our southern border. He shouldn't have been in our country. He was an illegal immigrant. Had our border not been broken, had our immigration laws not been continually ignored, he wouldn't have been in Georgia. And Laken Riley would still be alive. The man who killed Laken Riley was arrested at El Paso. He was then welcomed into the country with little obligation other than to follow the honor system, to show up for an appointment with the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, which he failed to do so. This is but one ripple in a wave of illegal immigrants drawn towards and allowed into our border by design. In his first 100 days in office, President Biden signed 94 executive orders to dismantle his predecessor's border policies for the simple reason that those policies actually reduced illegal immigration. He ended the Remain in Mexico policy. He scaled back border enforcement. He revived catch and release. He halted deportations. He allowed Title 42 to sunset. He abused our parole system, allowing millions of people into this country without proper vetting. Overwhelming not just our law enforcement in communities along the border, but also cities far from it. Cities in my home state of Indiana. Last December alone, 300,000 people were processed at the southern border, an all-time high. Mr. President, I request 2 more minutes.
Without objection.
And 9 million illegal immigrants, Mr. President, have crossed our border during President Biden's presidency. If only those among us who have spent as much time worrying about securing our southern border as they do about finding inoffensive terms to describe the man who illegally crossed it and then murdered Laken Riley. For over 3 years, I've urged the Biden administration to reverse its border policies. Record levels of illegal crossings are a national security issue. We know that. But they're also a crime and drug use issue in the state of Indiana and across the country, tragically evidenced by Laken Riley's death. The chaos this administration's policies have caused isn't confined to Texas, not confined to Arizona. Every state is a border state. And I appreciate the good faith efforts of some of my colleagues, Senator Lankford most notably, but others to find bipartisan solutions to strengthen our border security. And I remain hopeful that we in Congress can find the path to improving our border security laws and to actually enforcing them. But the occupant of the Oval Office is not powerless to act. At times, President Biden presents himself as a border hawk, waiting on Republicans to give him the tools to end the crisis he created. We should note the president has routinely pushed the constitutional limits of his office in pursuit of political and policy goals, but now he claims when it comes to the border crisis, he's hemmed in from taking action by Congress. Despite the tough talk, we regular Americans would be forgiven for concluding that this administration wants the crisis on our southern border to continue. Prove us wrong, Mr. President. Fixing the border begins with you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, every year on this floor, a senator reads George Washington's farewell address. This year, Senator Cardin, who's retiring from this body, was given the honor of reading the address. It's so that we in the Senate remember the lessons from George Washington. So let's reflect on what's in George Washington's farewell address. And it is this quote: "Foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government." Well, the majority leader of the United States Senate certainly knows that, because 4 years ago, he quoted these very same words. Yet he ignored them totally today in this body when it comes to our ally, Israel. Hours ago, the senior senator from New York crossed the line by calling for a new government in Israel. Let's be clear. Israel is a democracy. It makes its own choice about who they want to lead them. Doesn't need to have a senator from New York's interference. The senator also made the outrageous statement that the Prime Minister of Israel, in the words of the senator from New York, is a, quote, obstacle to peace. This is exactly backwards. It is the terrorists, the rapists, the murderers of Hamas who are the obstacles to peace. Let us be clear, demonizing our friends is not going to protect them from the brutality of Hamas. It only works to alienate our allies. It puts our common goals of peace further out of reach. Israel deserves an ally that the people of Israel can trust, most especially when they are battling terrorism. Senators on both sides of the aisle in this body have affirmed that Israel has every right to defend itself. We must also respect Israel's right as a democracy to choose its own destiny. Mr. President, now on a separate matter, I come to the floor to speak about President Biden's State of the Union speech. Speech is likely a preview of his 2024 acceptance speech at the Democrat convention this summer in Chicago. From start to finish, it was the angriest, most partisan, most divisive, and most vindictive State of the Union that I can recall. President Biden used his most important speech in 50 years to launch a direct attack on half of America. Shouted, lied about them, belittled their concerns, and if people had the gall to disagree with him, he screamed that they were the enemies of democracy. President Biden said all of this to hide his disastrous record of failures. 3 years ago, President Biden said, without unity, he said, there is only bitterness and fury. Last Thursday night, what we saw from President Biden was bitterness and fury. To me, this was an insult to every American. The President showed no respect for the American people, for our institutions, or for the truth. Instead, we heard an hour of dismissals, denials, distortions, and deceptive spin. President Biden is only himself to blame. It is his disastrous policies that cause us to be in the mess that we find ourselves. President Biden said, quote, "The state of our union is strong and getting stronger." Well, that may be his opinion, but it's not what the American people believe. Prices are up 18% today compared to the day that he took office. President Biden said he needs new laws to secure the border. That's not true either. President Biden has the power to secure the border, and he knows it. He simply lacks the backbone. During his first 100 days, the president took 94 executive actions that threw our border wide open, stopped building the wall, turned detain and deport into catch and release, and more than 9 million illegal immigrants have poured across our southern border since Joe Biden became president. Now, that includes hundreds of terrorist suspects, thousands of hardened criminals. This is dangerous for our country, Mr. President, yet Joe Biden can't say that. Since his speech last Thursday, he has spent more time groveling for using the term illegal immigrant than apologizing for not knowing the name of Laken Riley. People all across the country remember her as the 24-year-old nursing student who was murdered by an illegal immigrant. President Biden also claimed our global alliances are stronger than they ever were. That's not true. Since Joe Biden became president, America has lost its standing in the world. Our allies don't trust us. Our enemies don't fear us. By every metric, we are worse off today than we were the day Joe Biden took office. 7 in 10 Americans say that our nation is heading in the wrong direction. No amount of scolding or lecturing by the president is going to change that. No amount of yelling will cover up President Biden's endless failures to lower prices. Yelling by President Biden is not going to restore confidence in the American dream, which his own inflation eroded. Angry blame shifting by President Biden is not going to stop the flood or reverse the flood of the 9 million illegal immigrants and illegal border crossings. Nor will it protect innocent Americans from the illegal immigrant crime. Families in my home state in Wyoming and all across America are fed up with the Biden blame game. Americans are not imagining that their grocery bills are higher than they ever were before. The bills actually are higher. Americans aren't imagining that the border is more dangerous than ever before. it is more dangerous. And watching President Biden's speech, clear to the people all across Wyoming and to like-minded Americans that the president doesn't listen. Fortunately, Senate Republicans are listening. You heard it last week from the junior senator from Alabama. Her response was remarkably positive. Unlike President Biden, she offered a bright vision for the future of our nation. The senator said, "Together we can reawaken the historic spirit of our great nation," and she is right. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I just want to say for the record, it's been 36 days since Republican colleagues voted down the strongest border security bill in decades. So that's a reality. But what I wanted to speak about was the president's budget. When he was growing up, President Biden's dad used to say this: "Don't tell me what you value, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value." Well, President Biden's budget just came out, and I'll tell you what he values. President Biden values investing in the middle class so that families are able to work hard and get ahead and build a better life for their children. He values ensuring that teachers and firefighters aren't paying more taxes than billionaires. And he values Social Security and Medicare, programs that have lifted up millions of older Americans out of poverty. A whole generation, a great American success story. Meanwhile, we have the Republican nominee, the former president, in a CNBC interview vowing to cut Medicare and Social Security. Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. The Biden budget invests in growing our middle class, continuing the policies that have made our economy the strongest in the world. Since President Biden and Vice President Harris took office, the economy has added about 15 million new jobs, the most ever in the first term of a president. The unemployment rate has stayed below 4% for 2 years in a row. We haven't seen that in more than 50 years. Wages are up, the stock market is up, new small businesses are up. Meanwhile, the Republican agenda slashes investments in our families while cutting taxes for the wealthy. Republicans like to talk about cutting the deficit. Meanwhile, President Biden is doing it. His budget would reduce the deficit by $3 trillion by making the wealthy pay their fair share and cracking down on tax cheats. The Biden budget lowers costs for families in a number of ways. It invests in affordable child care so that working families aren't scrambling to find quality care at a price they can afford. It increases affordable housing and helps American families buy their first home and achieve their dream. Meanwhile, it makes higher education more affordable and cuts the burden of student debt. And it continues to lower prescription drug costs, helping people afford the medications they need. And best of all, it restores the expanded child tax credit, which was enacted as part of the American Rescue Plan. The expanded child tax credit helped cut child poverty in half in 2021. And President Biden's budget brings it back, giving families some breathing room. We also know that families are concerned about our national security. The Biden budget invests in a secure border through technology that detects fentanyl, more border patrol officers, more immigration judges, more asylum officers, so the decisions can be made quickly on who should be allowed to remain in the country. And finally, the Biden budget protects and strengthens Social Security and Medicare. These aren't just government programs, they're a promise that after a lifetime of hard work, you're going to be able to retire in dignity. Meanwhile, Republicans continue through their presidential nominee to focus on cutting programs that break that promise.
Order, please. Please take your conversations off the floor.
Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value, Mr. President. A thriving middle class, safe communities, security for our seniors, and ensuring that the wealthy pay their fair share. That's what the president values. We've come a long way. It's time to build on the progress. Thank you. I yield the floor.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance